Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going over the full ACT and the timing and the layout of it. So there's 4 sections. Each of them have different tricks and strategies you can employ to figure out the timing, because you never want to leave like 5 of them blank at the end, because chances are some of those would be very easy to answer. So this is kind of to guarantee that you won't get caught off guard. And then also just going out over the layout and the types of questions that you'll see. Firstly, for the English test, so you'll see something like this on the top of your test, something along these lines, but it's basically 75 questions in 45 minutes, which sounds like a lot, but some of them are very easy to answer. Some of them take a little bit longer, but the general strategy, so if we were to just divide 45 minutes divided by 75 questions, 45 minutes divided by 75 questions times 60 seconds. So this is just calculating seconds per question, and that comes out to 36 seconds per question on average. But generally, you want to save a little bit of time or bank on saving some time to go back or spending a little bit more time on some of the more difficult questions. So we just rounded this down kind of to 30 seconds per question. This is just going to give you that extra time that you need when you're 30 seconds is really general, but it'll allow you to get that extra time when you're getting stuck on some of them, and extra time at the end to go back. The other thing about the ACT English is that you don't really know what the passages are going to be about, but you know that there are 5 passages total, and each passage has 15 questions. So it's always 15 questions in each passage, and so 15 times 5 is 75. 75 questions, 5 passages, 15 questions per passage. So if you want to calculate the amount of time that you should be spending per passage, so if it's 30 seconds per question, then you would have 30 seconds times 15 questions, which would be 7 minutes and 30 seconds per each passage. If you really want to make it that precise, what I do when I normally go through it is just check my watch, maybe every 20 questions ish. Because what you can do, the other reason we rounded down to 30 seconds is it makes the mental math of where you should be a lot easier. Say I'm at 22 minutes and 30 seconds, multiply that by 2, so take 22.5 times 2, and that would just be, 45? So 45, you should be on your 45th question at 22 and a half minutes. So basically, multiply the time that you have by 2, like 7.5 times 2 is 15. That's what the question that you should be on. Again, if you were to do this 30 seconds per question, you'd be left with, I think, 7.5 minutes at the end of the test, because this is so shortened from 36 to 30. So that's a lot of time. So you don't need to stick to this completely. It's just a very general rule of thumb. It makes the mental math of what you're supposed to be at a lot easier. But yeah, that's basically the English test. The next section, you would take this immediately after the English, is the math section. So we had 75 questions in 45 minutes on the English, and then you'd see something along these lines for your math section. So 60 minutes for 60 questions. Obviously, you can see that you would be taking around a minute per question. The math is pretty simple here. So a minute per question would be 60 minutes for 60 questions, but you really don't want to do this because the beginning the beginning half is so much easier than the end part. Especially the last 10 questions are so much harder than any of the beginning part. If you're taking a minute per question in the beginning and it's just asking you to subtract 2 numbers, you're going to be well out of time at the end when you get some insane thing from geometry that you haven't seen in 5 years. But yeah, so the idea is to go faster in the beginning than you are at the end. So that's the general idea. Faster in the beginning, slower at the end, because the questions get harder. But there's a strategy we can employ to kind of allot for that. So we want to go faster in the beginning and slower at the end. So why don't we divide the test up and divide it so that we're going faster in the beginning and slower at the end? Well, we call it the 20-20-20 method, and that just means 20 minutes, 20 minutes, and 20 minutes. So dividing the 60 minutes into three sections of 20 minutes. 20 times 3 is 60 minutes. So the first 20 minutes, you're going to be taking the questions faster. The second 20 minutes, medium pace. And the third 20 minutes, you're going to be taking the questions the slowest. So the idea is to take the first 30 questions in the first 20 minutes, the next 20 questions in the next 20 minutes, and the last 10 questions in the last 20 minutes. So wrote that down over here. So here are the minutes, 20, 20, 20. The first 20 go to the first 30 questions. So the first 30 questions, questions 1 through 30, you should be taking 20 minutes. The next 20 minutes, so your watch is at 20 minutes right now, and then the next 20 minutes you will spend doing the next 20 questions, 31 through 50. And then your watch is at 40 minutes now. It's in the last 20 minutes that you have, you will spend it on the last 10 questions, 51 through 60. Like I said, the last 10 are way harder than any of these, which is why you're taking these a lot faster, 3 times as fast as these ones. So the math comes out to, the timing comes out to, so we said 60 minutes for 60 questions is about a minute per question, but what you should actually be doing is around 40 seconds per question in the beginning, 60 seconds per question in the middle, and 120 seconds per question at the end. So the first 30 is 40 seconds per question for each of those. So the first 30 questions you take at 40 seconds each, the next 20 questions you take at a minute each, and the last 10 questions you take at 2 minutes each. So this is twice as slow as this. This is 3 times as slow as this, but you are going to be very thankful that you are spending more time on the last 10. Right after the math, you would take a 10-minute break. So you had 45 minutes on the English, an hour on the math, 10-minute break, so that's about 2 hours or an hour and 55 minutes into the test. This break is just to eat food if you brought it, or talk to others about things that aren't the test. But right after your break, you would go to back-to-back reading and science. So reading and science are very similar. They both have the same amount of minutes per questions. They're both 35 minutes for 40 questions. And they also both have passages. So if you remember the math, that's like individual questions, and the English kind of had the questions next to or alongside the passage that it went to. But the reading and the science, you just read something before answering the set of questions that go along to it. So each passage is unique. None of the questions in the passage relate to any of the questions in the other passages. So the strategy here, the reading, this is a little bit easier to do, but you can skip around to whichever passages you are strongest at first, and then save time at the end for the ones that you're worse at, because you would have gotten most of those wrong anyway, or more of those wrong than your other stronger passages. So with reading and science, you can skip around between passages, and that is totally okay because the questions in the passages are unrelated to the questions in the other passages. All right, so instead of thinking about it as minutes per question now for timing, since there's time before you actually start answering the questions to read the passage, or you're going to spend time reading the passage and going back to the questions, we're just going to do it as minutes per passage. That'll make it a little bit easier. But if we have 35 minutes for 4 passages, that comes out to exactly 8 minutes and 45 seconds per passage. But if we round that down, that's about 8 minutes and 30 seconds per reading passage. This, again, we rounded down, makes the mental math a little bit easier. 8 minutes and 30 seconds times 2 is just 17 minutes. So 17 minutes in, you should be halfway done-ish. And that's just rough, again. That extra time is going to be for you to go back or spend more time on the questions that were a little bit more difficult. So this just allots for that. But now let's look at a reading test. The layout is always the same, the passage order. So let's see what that looks like. All right, here we have a reading test. I think this is the 2019 one. But here you can see it's 35 minutes for 40 questions, like we said. But what I would like to point to is each of these passages. So we said there's 4 passages, and they always go in the same order. So the first passage is always going to be fiction or fictional prose, which is very broad, so it could just be any story or anything like that. So that's passage 1, and then you have 10 questions. Passage 2 is always going to be social science, so that would be psychology, sociology, geography, any of those. And then you have the 10 questions, and then passage 3 is always going to be humanities. So that's like philosophy, art, culture, stuff like that. And then passage 4 is always going to be natural science, which is just natural science, astronomy, geology, anything like that. So if you figure out that you are better at science passages. Do these first. Flip your booklet 3 pages and do passage 4 before you do anything else. Or if you find out that you're terrible at humanities, you're terrible at passage 3 consistently, save that for the end. If you would have normally gotten 5 wrong on that, then you can save it for the end and get 5 wrong anyway, because you would have spent more time on the beginning ones getting all of those right. If that makes sense. So figure out which passages you're best at, what your strengths are, and then play to those, because especially for the reading and the science, skip around. The world is your oyster. Do whatever you want to make sure that you get the best possible. And then immediately after the reading, you would go to the science section. Again, 35 minutes for 40 questions, and it also has passages, but you don't really know how many passages or how many questions per passage, because it varies passage to passage or test to test. But generally, it's about 6 or 7 passages, and each passage would have around 6 or 7 questions. So if you had 7 passages, you would have around 6 questions. 6 times 7 is 42, so that's around 40. If you had 6 passages, each one would have about 7 questions. 6 times 7 is 42. So to time that, you would divide 35 minutes by around 6 or 7 passages, and that comes out to about 5 or 6 minutes per passage. If we want to round that down, though, that's about 5 minutes per passage. And this is kind of the rule of thumb that you should use, similar to 8:30 per passage. Now the science is around 5 minutes per passage. But as far as the actual passage types go, you have 3 types of passage. Again, you don't know what order they're going to be in. You did on the reading, out on the science. But you generally have around 3 passages of research summary. So that's like experiments and the results of those. You have about 2 passages of data representation. So that's like graphs and tables and charts, and less writing than the research summary. And conflicting viewpoints, you would have around 1 passage. This one is like student 1, student 2, or scientist A or scientist B, any of those. These generally have the most reading to do before you answer the questions, which is why there are less of them. Data representation has less reading because it's just looking at tables and charts mostly, and the research summary kind of varies. But let's see what those look like on an actual test. All right, back at the 2019 test, we got 35 minutes for 40 questions. But looking for each passage type, this first passage would be research summary, because they kind of just describe a study, and then they have different studies that go along with it, study 1 and study 2, and some graphs. So like I said, you should take about 5 minutes per passage, so take these ones at about 5 minutes if you can. Something like this would be a data representation, so it's basically a lot less writing and a lot more tables and graphs, so it looks a little overwhelming, but these generally go a little bit faster, actually, than any of the other ones. So I said 5 minutes on average per passage. You should probably take these a little bit quicker, so maybe 4 minutes or 4.5 minutes per data representation passage, because I know it looks complicated, but all you're doing for these is pretty much reading a graph, and that's a lot faster than reading 2 paragraphs of a study. And the last one, conflicting viewpoints. So we got that student 1 and student 2 thing going on. You're always going to get only 1 passage of this, I think, and each passage is always going to be 7 questions. So with that, you're going to take these a little bit slower, not slower, but a little bit more time for these, because you have to read all of this, and then you have to kind of figure out what all of the students are saying, and then answer the questions based off of that. So like I said, about 5 minutes per passage, but for these ones, it's about 6 minutes per passage. You're going to thank yourself for that extra time and figuring out what each student or scientist is saying. But in conclusion, about 5 minutes per passage for the science, and that comes out to about 5 minutes per passage for the research summary ones, so that's like experiments and stuff. About 4 minutes per passage for the data representation ones, all the data, the graphs, and the tables, and then about 6 for these ones, or the conflicting viewpoints. And then you're technically done. But sometimes you get a 5th passage or an experimental passage for the ACT to try some different material out. So that'll be anything from English to science. It could be any one of the 4 types of tests, but it's generally not as long as a full test of them. It's usually around like 1 or 2 passages or like 20 questions of math, something like that. But if they give you that, that's about 3.5 hours of the ACT. And if they don't, then that's about 3 hours and 5 minutes. But then if you're taking the writing, you would take a 5-minute break and then on to the writing. So you took your ACT, maybe had a fifth section, took a break. Now we have the writing section. So the writing section, I did not very good at this, so this is just what other people said. So it's 40 minutes, I know that for sure, but about 5 minutes for the pre-writing, and then about 35 minutes for writing the actual 5-paragraph essay. Again, I didn't do very well on this, so I'm not really going to expound much, but you want to spend time pre-writing. You have like 3 theses that you can choose from and like support or refute them. I honestly forgot how that worked. But the writing is 40 minutes, so that comes out to 4 hours total-ish for the full ACT test. So hopefully that was helpful to you. That's kind of how I did my timing for these ones anyway, and for the English and the math. So if you want to use any of that, use it. If not, throw it all away. That's fine with me. But I hope this was slightly helpful to you. I'll see you in the next one.